we are drug addict with oil. The challenge is that oil, it has incredible specificities. I love that example that someone called Pablo Servigny is using. If you put a liter of oil in your car and you drive, and at one point that liter of oil runs out, you get out of your car and you push your car backward to come back to where you started. It takes you a month to go back. So that's the multiples we're talking about. So 1 liter of oil equals a month of working manpower. And if you look at minimum salary, 1,500 versus €1 or $1.5 for a liter. That's the orders of magnitudes we're talking about. So the vision we're trying to achieve is to go from variable and fluctuant energy bill to a fixed energy bill.
Right.
And it's a bit what happened in the telecom 10 years ago, where you used to pay per data, and suddenly you went on unlimited data bill, but with a fixed cost. And that's our vision, and that's what we're trying to achieve, and that's our next big thing.
All right. Good afternoon, Ondine. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I'm going to introduce myself quickly. So I'm Hippolyte Durand Seidl. I'm passionate about sustainability and about entrepreneurship and venture capital as well. And that's why we have you today on this podcast, because you created your startup in the green energy sector. And we're going to have the chance to talk about it today. Maybe Avinash, you also want to introduce yourself?
Yep. Thanks a lot for being here. I'm Avinash. I've been building products since I was 16. Launched a couple of startups, super interested in the VC space. Beyond all of these, I love debating as well. And I run a startup where we teach kids debating. So that's where my curiosity for talking to people who've built ventures and also understanding where they come from actually stems. And the whole objective for us to start this podcast was to get entrepreneurs like you who've gone through that journey to share their ideas, their experiences, and their learnings with the next generation of people who are building their products, ventures, or even innovators for that matter. So the whole objective is, how do we take your knowledge and make sure that somebody could learn from it and build their own venture? So that's the context that we have for the whole podcast.
Yes. Thank you so much, Avinash. And to introduce you, Ondine, I would like to tell a little story of how I met you. Actually, it was at INSEAD. You were doing a talk about during the entrepreneurship forum, and you talked about your venture, and it was very touching. You also talked about your children and how it motivated you to actually carry on this way and to really want to disrupt the energy sector to make it greener than ever, to solve that goddamn climate change issue we have on our hands. And so it was very touching to me. And when I heard you talk, I really wanted to know more about your story. And I guess that's why we're here also. Maybe you can introduce yourself for our audience.
So I'm Ondine. I'm co-CEO and co-founder of MyLight150, which is a company that tries to make solar our first source of energy. How? We actually promote the installation of solar panels on rooftops. And then what's really important once you have solar panel on the rooftop is to change the way you consume your energy, to make sure you consume when you produce. And so we are really having a 360-degree approach about your energy bill. And we are a company that also has all the competencies to help you over time to reduce significantly your energy bill and also obviously make it greener because you make it solar.
Okay, great.
Yep. So building a startup is something that is super ambitious, right? So if you were to take a look back at your youth, where do you think this ambition to build the things and change the world actually stems for you?
Well, it's going to be really surprising in today's world where being an entrepreneur is almost one of the sexiest jobs for the young, educated children. At the time, 10 years ago, I really became an entrepreneur without really realizing it. I was at INSEAD. I had already had an experience in the Silicon Valley, but I was an engineer part of a scale-up, which is not really as strategic, but obviously I wasn't part of the strategic decisions. And then I decided to do INSEAD. And during my INSEAD year, I was about to take on another job, and my brother called me. I was already in solar, and so was he. And he was mentioning an idea, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Well, let's just dig into it. And we started digging into it. And from one thing to the next, you end up launching your company. But it really wasn't something massively planned. I was just young, without any constraint, without children, without any big financial burden. So it wasn't very risky for me at the time, or I hadn't seen it this way. And I never left. That's how it happened.
Okay, interesting. And yeah, so you did that with your brother. So I guess that's interesting, right? Because not all companies start like that with a family. How is it going? Are you still with your brother in doing the same business? Are you working together?
Yeah, we're still working together. We're both CEOs, and we're actually extremely complementary. I think to make founding teams, I would say, work, you need to be very complementary on the day-to-day, but also have similar ambition, similar vision. So those fundamentals need to be very much the same. And then operationally, you need to be complementary. And you also need to respect each other. And because you respect each other, you also talk to each other very honestly. And that's how you can keep moving.
Right. Yep. So one of the things that stands out for me in your journey, right? This was your first venture, and this venture has grown up to be so massive. So how did you have this knack for entrepreneurship? Were you always a child who was always building something when you were younger? Or was it more towards your college and INSEAD where this entrepreneurship exposure came? Or was it more, I'll figure it out as I build my venture kind of thing for you?
Well, now that I've done numerous personality tests at INSEAD, outside INSEAD, I know that by essence, I'm a doer. I'm someone who does things. And when there is a problem, I'm putting myself into action and much more into reflection. And I guess that's one of the characteristics you can find at entrepreneurs. The other one that I see across everyone I know who's an entrepreneur is the optimistic aspect of a personality. You're constantly solving problems, but you're not seeing it this way. You're just seeing it, I'm going forward. And that's, I think, the characteristic that I intrinsically had in me without even knowing it. And that's why, well, when my brother was like, oh, I had that idea, and I immediately started, okay, so we could do it this way. And I got into action, and I got the ball rolling. And that's probably how it all started. The fact that it became really big, I had already, when I finished my engineering studies, decided to work in the energy industry from the very beginning, or at least at the end of my study. I chose that major because I knew, one, the strategic aspect of it. I was already conscious of its impact on our environment, our societies, and if you move even our geopolitics, the energy world is infinite and has a very big impact on our societies. You have a few others that could have interested me. The ones I have in mind is the health industry, but I'm not a doctor, so it's much harder to launch a venture in that field. The other one is the ag industry, that aspect. For me, those three industries are industries that have such a massive impact on our societies. You can go very far when you start getting into ventures, and you have a lot of options. And it's also industries that still today stay quite traditional. And so you have potential to, we're not disrupting, we're building differently, but you have those options because it's still areas that are still very traditional. Anything that's like e-commerce related has been very much worked on already. The other thing that's been disrupted quite a lot recently is like everything that's finance related. You have a lot of fintech. So the energy, not yet really. It's really starting because it has a complexity that it's big products, like it's hardware, it's big capex. So I knew when I chose the energy that it had an infinite options, and that it was going to be more than just a technical challenge, and that it was going to have dimensions such as social or geopolitical that really interested me. So that's why when you start doing a venture in energy, you very quickly grow big because you're on a big topic. Without even noticing. And we stay very, very small in that field. Like, don't get me wrong, we're absolutely minuscule compared to the big guys that have been around for hundreds of years.
Yes. Okay, super interesting. And would you consider yourself as passionate about the environment and sustainability? And if so, was there a specific event or person that really shaped your vision?
The conscious of the fact that this matters to me arrived very late in my career, and arrived actually, and that's when you heard me talk about it.
Yes.
It arrived when I became conscious of that aspect when I became a mom. Before that, I was interested in the topic, but it wasn't as important or as embedded in me as before. But yeah, I will not name it, but I did an internship in a big petroleum company. I'll let people look at my LinkedIn. And I decided, so at the time I was 20 plus, and I decided I was incapable of working in that industry. It was just not aligned with my core values. So from a very early age, I had that. I'm not someone who's going to go protest, attach myself on nuclear plants that actually are part of the solution more of the problem, or go spill oil during protests.
Yes.
So I'm not that type of extreme. I admire, in a sense, people that can put that level of risks and do that. But I definitely want to be part of that solution and finding a solution versus oil and gas, which now is nobody can discuss it anymore. The core of the problem for climate change. We are drug addict with oil for very good reasons. It's an incredible product that brought the level of wealth that we have today in our societies, but now it became the problem. And it's really hard to do differently because it's so easy, so powerful, so cheap if you only look at on the first glance. And then when you start looking at all the consequences, environmental, health and everything, you realize the actual cost, but it's much harder to measure that second cost, like the bad cost of oil.
Thanks a lot for giving an overview of your journey. Now we'll move on to a more sector-specific kind of thing. And the way we like to approach it is we go to the first principles and try to understand everything from the basics, right? So bear with us as we go through something very basic that we expect everybody to know, but we want you to define what the green energy space is according to you, so that everybody who's listening to this podcast truly understand what it means.
Okay. So in the energy space, you need to understand, so we're talking global energy and not just electricity and things like that.
Right.
And most of energy today in the world comes from oil and gas, more than 2/3.
Right.
And oil and gas, you have coal, you have obviously the petroleum in your car, you have like all of those different usages. You have the fertilizer for agriculture. This is what we're talking about. So we are in a world dominated by oil and gas. And it is now, and it's been identified in the 70s with the Meadows report, and it's now confirmed by several independent studies across the world that it is the number one source of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, and the number one source of climate change and global warming. So it is today a real problem. The challenge is, as I just mentioned, that oil has incredible specificities. I love that example that someone called Pablo Servigny is using. If you put a liter of oil in your car and you drive, and at one point that liter of oil runs out, you get out of your car and you push your car backward to come back to where you started. It takes you a month to go back. So that's the multiples we're talking about. So 1 liter of oil equals a month of working manpower. And if you look at minimum salary, 1,500 versus €1 or $1.5 for a liter. I don't know the exact what it's traded at right now. That's the orders of magnitudes we're talking about. So it's a massive change. And one of the solutions for that is switching our usage to electrical usage, and then have that electricity produced by renewable or carbon-free sources of energy. You have two big spaces, the nuclear space and the renewable space. So to get out of a world dominated by oil, you have two steps. One, electrifying our usage, going from cars that use petroleum to a car that uses electricity, going from a gas boiler to an electrical boiler. So this is step number one. And step number two is producing that new demand of electricity with carbon-free sources, and the cheapest today and fastest to deploy is renewable. And when you think about renewable, you have three main sources of renewable electricity, which is solar, which is wind turbine, and then hydro. You have a little bit of a topic around biogas, so gas made out of this is really not my field of expertise, so I cannot give you any orders of magnitude on that. But so everyone knows, there is also a topic about the green gas.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third thing that people may have heard about is the hydrogen revolution.
Yes.
The hydrogen revolution is not a replacement of that, because you still need energy to produce the hydrogen. So it's a way to store that energy, or it's a way also to decarbonize some mobility usage. Typically, it's going to be really hard to fly a plane with a battery, and it's probable that we're going to go towards hydrogen planes or hydrogen hypertrucks or that type of things. So that's the two usage for hydrogen today. But it's not a replacement of the green electricity and of that green space. So I don't know if my overview is clear, but that's how I view the market.
Yes, it's quite clear. Yeah, we see the different parts. Thank you very much for that. It's very clear. And do you encounter misconceptions about the green energy sector?
Well, in some countries, and specifically the country I'm in, there are some people that put green energy against nuclear. It's not what we're talking about. We need to put green energy against oil and gas. That's what we're talking about. And I think that's the number one misconception where we need to be careful of. What we're trying to do, again, is replace oil and gas.
So we talked about why you picked the energy sector. That was more of your competency, right? But moving into solar, right? Was there a hunch or an industry trend that you saw that made you move on to solar? Why did you decide on solar 10 years ago, even before it became massively mainstream and everybody's talking about it as much as they do now?
Well, I'm in solar. I've been 22 years in solar. So because I finished my diploma on solar technology. Right. My engineering school diploma, because I met a professor who was one of the pioneers in solar at my school, and I've discovered that industry, which is one at the time it was. So I'm a chemical engineer and specialized in semiconductor. You need to know that the photovoltaic effect has been discovered and studied by the same people that worked on the nuclear effect. So from a science perspective, that effect is absolutely fascinating, extremely complex. We're in the nanospace. And that was already at the time very fascinating for me, because it's everything linked with the electrons, crossing voids and going into holes and things like that. So it's quite complex. I wasn't very good at it, but I just thought it was fascinating. And that's how I discovered the space. And at the time, we're talking 2007, it was the very beginning of the solar subsidies across the world, right, to encourage that technology. The leading countries were Japan, where I finished my studies, and Europe was quite ahead, with Germany quite ahead on that. Historically, it had been the US who was very much ahead of this. And in the Silicon Valley, where I started working, you had, for those who remember, in 2002, you had a tech bubble. And after that, you started having a green tech trend in the Silicon Valley. And you had a few companies that were, I would say, deep tech, quite CapEx intensive, that were trying to build new manufacturing plants for solar. So that's how I ended up in the Valley. But solar, when you start looking at it, it's an extremely powerful source of energy. Well, you cannot really beat the sun to start with, so it's absolutely infinite. Of course, you have the day-night issue, but that's something that can be worked around. But also, it's something you can very, very well predict. If you know the weather tomorrow, you can exactly know how much a solar panel is going to produce. So that's a big plus. And the other thing is the only electricity source and even energy source that you can put on every single home, like extremely close to the consumption. You have no other ones. A wind turbine, to start being reliable, needs to be 10 meter high. You don't put that in your garden. Well,
Yeah.
Solar, you can deploy it absolutely everywhere. And even if you don't have a grid, you can put solar. And it was the first usage of solar was to start bringing energy in places where you didn't have any. And so once you start looking at the applications of solar, I find it absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. It's very, very fascinating. And if you were to meet a passionate individual with a very dynamic, and they wanted to identify some opportunities to build for the future of energy like you, would you have some advice for them to start looking at some directions? I don't know, maybe you identified some trends they could follow?
Well, one big trend, which is actually coming from renewable, is that once you've deployed the infrastructure, producing the next electron costs absolutely nothing. So that's a big, big trend, because the sun doesn't send you the bill, or the wind does not send you the bill, which is very different from any other source of energy. And once you think about that, that means the energy in itself will have zero value. Because the infrastructure you're deploying when you're deploying solar or wind costs very little to maintain, slightly more for wind than for solar, but very little to maintain. And solar panel is warranted 30 years. So it's going to be actually producing way, way more. And the panels of the 70s still are producing. So the cost of energy is going to turn to zero. What's going to be a real challenge is to consume that energy when we have it.
Yeah, that's maybe where hydrogen comes in, no? Can't you produce hydrogen?
Can come in, but also the change of habit. You have a lot of usage, and let's not necessarily look at residential, look at industries. It's extremely rare industries that actually run 24/7 with machines running 24/7s. They tend to have running times, and they do a batch or a lot. And so how are you going to have to adapt all of your consumption to the weather? And in other industries, we don't even think about it. We already do it. Well, not necessarily with the tech, but if you take the ag industry, if you want to eat strawberries in the winter, well, we're just going to put the cost. It's going to the price, because you're going to have to grow those strawberries in a greenhouse that's heated by gas often, and on top of that, it's not going to be very good because you're not going to have sun. So what really you're doing is that in winter you're not eating strawberries, you're actually eating apple because it's much easier to keep, or you're eating leek soup and potatoes. So you already adapt your consumption to a price signal. And in energy, for the longest time, countries actually haven't encouraged the consumption where you had the biggest amount of production, because the cost of gas was more or less the same all year long. You didn't have that seasonality effect. And that's going to be very different when you start having a massive amount of renewables in the grid. You're going to have free energy in the middle of summer or in the middle of the day, and much more expensive energy in winter, which is not necessarily the case when you have a good mix of wind and solar, because they're actually very complementary. But in any case, you're going to have to learn to consume your energy when it's free. And that opens tons of options for ventures. Because how do you help people benefit from that free energy? What do you have to put in place in terms of habit? So you can either do it automatically, which is what we're trying to do with homes. You can work on the social aspect to encourage it differently. All the nudge, if you looked at all those topics that encourage benefit behaviors. So it's really, well, just to give you one option, this definitely is one.
I think Apple released a feature onto the MacBooks, which is super interesting and aligns with what you've said. There's an option where you can charge your Macs only when the energy grid is running on green energy.
Yeah.
I already see a tinge of what you've said in the world today, and I'm super excited to see the kind of ventures that, founders will build down the line. So we've identified this opportunity. We actually wanted to ask you another question about young founders building in this space, right? Assume that I want to build a venture in this space. What do you think the minimum capital I need to actually start off in this space is? Because I know it's a very capital intensive industry, right? I need to build my credentials. Let's assume I built my credentials and everything else. How much capital do I actually need to break into this industry?
Well, the industry, you have a lot of places. Some are very capex intensive. If you want to start building a solar panel manufacturing plant, we're talking $1.52 billion. So yes, that's very capex intensive. If you want to start building software that will help some industries to consume at a different moment, then right now you have a lot of new players coming in the flexibility market and that connect with APIs, objects, then turn it on and off to help the grid. Right. This is much less capex intensive. Oh. So depending on where you want to start to work, it's more or less capex intensive. Now that I've said that, with energy, which is what's different than with if you start working around finance, you have a physical flow to manage. And yes, at one point you will need to do some hardware. So some players will need to be very capex intensive. But you can be the little disrupting guy who's using the capex of the others to bring very innovative benefits.
Thanks a lot for those inputs.
Yes, I think now we can move and talk about MyLight150 in itself. So could you introduce the company and its vision?
So the vision of MyLight150 is to make solar the number one source of energy. If I am much more pragmatic, what we're doing is that we're installing an energy management system. So it's an electrical box that connects to the key consumers in the home, the EV charger, the boiler, the water heater, and the heating system, which is most of the time in our case heat pumps. We connect all those three objects, which is 80% of a home electricity bill, and we reduce their consumption doing two things: managing them and making sure they use solar mostly, and also making sure if they need complementary electricity that they consume when the spot market is the lowest, because we are also an energy provider. So in the company, we have all that IoT aspect, algorithm aspect to make sure everyone consumes when it's the right time, and the energy aspect with the trading team and all that type of things. Maybe in terms of key numbers, because I always forget to tell those, we're close to 250 employees, close to 100 million revenues, and we're a little bit more than 10 years old.
Wow, yeah, super interesting. And so, yes, starting and scaling a company is no small task, and especially back in 2012 for the solar energy, since it was not really developed back then. So do you have like an example of the biggest challenge you had to face?
Well, the biggest challenge are often people in the life of an entrepreneur. I wouldn't say so. From a technical perspective, typically becoming an energy provider was a big challenge because it's a brand new skill set that we didn't have, but we've hired a brilliant team, and so they help us do that. But over time, you need to understand that you never grow linearly, especially in our market. Our market has known like extremely fast growing years, and then years of slowdown, and then very fast growing years and years of slowdown. And when this happens, cutting spending is one thing, normal OPEX. Keeping the team motivated, united, and engaged in those sprints and then slow down is actually the most challenging part, in my opinion. And when you grow on top of that, you delegate part of this to your managers and the middle management, and creating that culture is really a challenge. Creating a really strong culture is really a challenge, especially when you have a lot of people that you onboard that come with different cultures. How do you create your own? Really something that we've seen as a challenge. And one of the turning point or tipping point is, I would say, when you arrive at 40, 60 employees, you stop hiring 100% of them. Because before you hire 100% of them. So without even thinking about it, you're doing a natural culture fit assessment because you interview them. Once you reach that 60 plus employees, you have some people that you haven't seen and that have been hired by your managers. And how do you make sure that the culture fit that you were doing without really thinking about it is being done? And so that's when you start thinking. So we're looking at what the best in class guys are doing with all the leadership principles, culture fit interview, all that type of things, creating a vision, core mission, and that's really passionates me and what is the hardest in my opinion as well.
Now that you have the people figured out, But let's touch upon the very nature of your business, right? Until, let's say, a couple of years ago, I would still classify it as a startup that's still scaling, or a scale up rather, right? And energy sector on top of that, by the virtue of it, is subject to a lot of changing regulation. So there's a lot of chaos in the industry that you're operating in. How did you navigate this chaos? What are the mental models that you use to navigate through this uncertainty and, build a very successful business?
Yes, I remember you mentioned the solar coaster. So maybe you can talk a bit about that as
well. So we're still a scale up first to make sure that we're all agreeing on that. I don't think we're an installed company. We've done a few things. First, we've tried to keep, until we had a strong visibility, to be as fast as possible, profitable. Not necessarily extremely profitable, but in a way that we could decide when we accelerate or not, and that we were not completely dependent on raising money. Because when the market is at the beginning of it, nobody sees the potential of your business because the market is invisible. So that's something we've done when the market was very, very small. And we've really only started accelerating investments when the market was picking up. Timing the market is really hard. And if you probably in a few years back, we'll say we were a bit early, which is fine. But when you're a bit early, how do you manage to wait for that market to pick up? Was the one thing we worked on. The other thing, at the very early stage, we try to have different sources of revenues to diversify our risks and our exposure to different markets or different sources, streams of revenues. So we had the distribution branch, we had the more innovative tech branch. We very early on entered Switzerland or Romania or even Spain a few years back, or even Italy at one point. And then typically we had a very good years in Italy. Then the market shifted, we've shut down Italy. But it helped us maybe overcome a more sluggish market in France at the time. So that's how we've tried to diversify ourselves to different revenue streams, whether it is products, competencies, or geographical markets. That's, I think, what we've done without necessarily being extremely theoretical about it. It just was a bit survivor instinct, I would say. Well, now we're much more structured, and when we launch initiatives, they're much more studied. And it's also because when you have more money, you invest more, so you expose yourself to more risks. We didn't have that much money at the beginning, so the risk exposure was much smaller.
So the energy sector is quite old, right? It's what, 19th century, something like that. So how do you manage to have like 22 patents today to still keep innovating in such a traditional, as you said, also industry?
Well, actually, doing patents, you can do a bunch of patents that are useless. Out of our 22, we don't really use, we still use a handful, but we don't use them as much. And we were actually more innovative, not necessarily in the energy, but the management of energy and the communication and all that type of things. So it's like niche of niche of niche, and that's you can always find a way to patent if you make the effort. I think it's actually a very good moment to innovate in energy. You have someone who's called Jeremy Rifkin, who identified that we're in a third energy revolution. And when you're in those moments where you have big shifts, the first shift was discovering the fire, I would say, and then the coal, oil and gas. So if you look at all the industrial revolutions, they're all linked to a change in energy sources. It's one of his, and you have several sources, change in energy sources, change in communication means, and those two things, or two or three factors, are actually the source of a revolution. And that's where we're in right now. The renewable link to the internet is actually creating a new revolution. A revolution of usage versus ownership. And so when you're in a revolution, well, everyone is challenged, even the bigger guy in the room. And so that's when you have opportunities. Without that revolution, we wouldn't have had opportunities.
Yep.
Fair enough. Yeah.
We were going through your pitch book. I see that MyLight150 has been putting up a little bit of capital muscle to capitalize on this revolution, right? So, and you also mentioned when you have more capital, you expose yourself to risk, right? And risk is reward. So my question now is, what is MyLight150's next big bet? What are you building your capabilities for? what opportunity are you positioning yourself to capitalize on?
So the vision we're trying to achieve is to go from variable and fluctuant energy bill to a fixed energy bill. And it's a bit what happened in the telecom 10 years ago, where you used to pay per data and suddenly you went on unlimited data bill, but with a fixed cost. And that's our vision. And that's what we're trying to achieve. And that's our next big thing, to say, okay, if you install the right thing in your home and we manage those things, we manage when you consume it based on the market price, we can ensure that you pay a fixed energy bill.
But would that not incentivize people to consume more?
No, because you have a little bit, and actually, you know what? It is awesome because they're going to consume free green energy. So if they can, the energy of the sun is infinite, and that's what we're trying to fight, is to say, of course, you need to reduce your consumption and things like that, except when you have sun. Like, sorry, but go ahead and use that free electricity and green electricity. And it's actually amazing because you can fight for a vision where energy is not becoming a constraint. It's becoming infinite, unlimited, a source of wealth. And that's actually what you're doing with renewable. Today, you start having some negative prices on the energy spot market across Europe. It's incredible. That means all of our industrial are going to be able to have free energy to produce. You cannot be more competitive than that. And on top of that, it's green. It's carbon free. So it's actually not an issue to consume when you have a lot of surplus of that energy. So again, we need to change our way we consume. To do a parallelism with ag again and food industry, when it's cherry season, go ahead, eat kilos of cherries. They're going to rot on the tree. So it's not an issue. But of course, in the middle of winter, that's a different topic.
Maybe we can talk about geopolitics. For example, uranium, when you talk about nuclear, is a big concern because it comes from Africa. So, other countries, if you live in Europe, for example, or in the US. But what about the solar panels? I think they come from China. Or do you think we will produce our own here in Europe? Or how do you see that going on?
So to give you numbers, 95% of the solar panels are actually, if you take the full value chain of solar panels, is dominated by China. So it's the facts, and it's actually going to get worse. They have double the capacity of production compared to the market.
Wow.
So they can produce 1.3 of solar panels per year, and we consume 600 gigawatts, so 0.6 as a market. So yes, we could build another manufacturing plant in Europe, but when you have double the manufacturing capacity, what's the point? Now that I've said that, when you install solar panels on your rooftop as a homeowner, the panel is 15%, 15% of your cost. So yeah, that's it. Solar panels became a commodity.
So what is it, the battery that's costly? Maybe?
Well, no, 50% is the manpower. It's actually the artisan who comes and spends a day to fix it on your roof. That's half of the bill. And then the rest is the material, and 1/3 of the material, you have the panel, 1/3 you have all the mounting system and things like that. 1/3 you have the inverter and the energy management system. Slightly more now for the inverter. You're going more towards 40%, and it used to be 1/3. Where you have the core value, because once the panels are on that roof, that's it. It's done. There is no intelligence in a panel. It's just producing direct current, and that's it. Where the intelligence is in the inverter. It's in the energy flows. That's where you have really the added value long term. To give you orders of magnitude, if you control 1 million of heat pumps, knowing that you have 20 million homes in France, for example, you control 2 nuclear plants. You control 2 gigawatts of consumption. So you can put down the electrical system by shutting them down altogether in winter. That's the challenge. And the long-term challenge is that. So it's great to have initiatives to bring back solar plant in Europe. In addition to that, solar panels that are produced with European electricity are cleaner and greener because the energy mix is cleaner. It's great to have those initiatives, but it's not the only core topic to address, and really managing the flows like day to day, second per second, because a blackout is a mismatch between demand and supply per second or millisecond or nanosecond. You can never ever have that imbalance, and that's key in the future of energy, and that's what's getting more and more complex if you have distributed sources of energy.
We've just been learning about supply demand mismatches, and I've been loving that whole topic. It almost seems like a very interesting video game to me. Now, you mentioned something about the product cost mix, right? And for me, 50% for installation cost, it just seems absurd. Are there any innovations happening to make it more like Lego blocks so that lower skilled people could build it up? Is that an opportunity that we are potentially looking at in this industry, or is that not something that we should focus on at this stage?
Well, despite that, solar is the cheapest source of energy.
Yeah.
So despite that cost, we're beating records every month. And you had a plant, I think it's in Portugal, that is actually, to give you orders of magnitude, all the nuclear, which is often considered the cheapest source of energy, cost, well, they're going to change the prices, but 50 euro per megawatt hours today, 42 to 48 euro per megawatt hours. And you have solar that can now cost 1 euro per megawatt hour. In some countries, such as Mexico or in Chile, where they give free energy, solar energy to the neighboring villages. So yes, it is a topic that 50% of the cost is installation. But on the other hand, it creates local jobs. So it's also great to have that spending.
So where is the bottleneck? Why aren't they popping up like mushrooms everywhere? Or maybe they are actually.
It is. It's been 20 years that solar is the number one source of energy in terms of installed capacity every single year. So it's been 20 years that solar is number one in terms of installed capacity. Well, bottleneck, obviously, some people would lose a lot of money if you start having nobody sending the bill anymore. So there is a true question around the balance of power. That's obvious. You also need to change habits, change equipment. You need to electrify. And today, what is slowing down the growth of solar in Europe is the slowing down of electrification. There isn't enough demand of electricity as we speak right now because electrification is slowing down. Because we're not installing heat pump as much as we should, because we're not electrifying our industry as much as we should. And that is quite capex intensive because you need to change your machines, you need to change your heating system, you need to change your car. And so today what's slowing down deployment of solar or green energy sources is actually the slowdown of electrification, slowdown of demand.
No, it's crazy. I started off this podcast with the intention to learn as much as I could. I knew nothing about the solar industry. I trusted Hippolyte. I knew that you had a great founding story. And now by the end of 40 minutes, there's a lot that I've learned. And it's been a wonderful session. And there are two key questions that we wanted to ask you towards the last leg of this session, right? First, what's one belief you strongly held when you were starting out in your entrepreneurial journey that now you have completely changed your mind about?
Oh, that's a very good question because I tend not to hold too much beliefs, and that's probably why I end up being an entrepreneur. Because if you have too much beliefs, it's something that I got comforted on one of my beliefs, which was the key value of a company is people, and that stays a belief I hold really strongly. Even though it doesn't show on an everyday basis, and you tend to be seen as making tough decisions, being cold, and it's normal because that's your job. I strongly believe that the value of the company my brother and I are building is the value of the people and our ability to embark them behind our vision, help them give the best they can and the best they are on a daily basis, because a company is a marathon and you need to embark those people for a marathon. And that's something I believe that got strengthened over time.
If you had 5 minutes to address to the ambitious, like 20-something years old in the world, what would you say to them about the urgency of building, creating, leading the way forward?
If you want to lead, do not hold yourself, because you have more people that wait than people that actually act and do. So do not hold yourself. If you want to be an entrepreneur, which is a slightly different question, and change the world, you really need to do it, or I feel in my journey that it's essential to do it for something that really matters to you.
Right.
Because the amount of time you're going to be spending on that topic, because you do not change topic when you're an entrepreneur. You cannot just change job and then you were in the energy industry and suddenly you're in the health industry. Like that doesn't work, because you're attached to that company. So if the topic does not deeply interest you and deeply drives you, it's not going to work, because money is not a big enough driver as an entrepreneur. Too much effort for what you're earning, because you're earning long term, like you're not earning short term. So I've never seen an entrepreneur that's only driven by money. That's something that's it's pretty obvious to me. And all of them are true passionate about their topic, and try to pick a topic that you're passionate about. If it's food industry and if it's giving pleasure to people when they eat, just build a restaurant. Who cares if the idea is one of the oldest ideas in the world? If you're passionate about it, you're going to be better than everybody else. And that's where you should go. So don't try to find a unique idea that actually does not exist. We're 8 billion on that earth. Well, no idea is unique. Like, it's not possible. You have another smart cookie somewhere in the world that actually had that idea. So just choose something that you want to wake up for every morning and work on every morning, because you're not going to switch. If you launch your company, you're not going to switch. You're in for the long run.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. This session was wonderful. Thanks a lot for being a wonderful guest.
Thank you very much. Well, happy to meet you again. And well, let's hope to see each other in person again.